I'm Karen Hornby, I'm Science Subject Specialist here at the National STEM Learning Centre.
And I'm Paul Howard-Jones. I'm Professor of Neuroscience and Education at the University of Bristol.
And I'm Tim Jay. I'm a Professor of Psychology of Education at Sheffield Hallam University.
Jan asks, are there any activities that will help demonstrate brain plasticity to her students?
So I would say that anything that involves learning means that plasticity is at work. So probably brain plasticity is being demonstrated throughout the school day, I hope. But possibly reversing habits that are acquired over a long time can feel an impressive way to demonstrate plasticity. So one way of doing that would be practicing mirror writing. And to begin with, it feels like it's impossible if you're using a mirror to look in when you're guiding your writing. But after a while, you quickly get the hang of it. There have also been some fun demonstrations that I've seen using a periscope or glasses that shift your vision to the left or right. And then you try and throw something into a waste paper bin. And at first, it's completely impossible. But eventually you adjust, you learn, your brain rewires itself and allows you to improve. So that's kind of an effective way of showing how the brain can rewire itself and learn and adapt to a new situation.
Claire would like to know, is there any more information available about encouraging growth mindsets rather than closed mindsets?
So I wondered with this question, it's interesting comparing the growth mindset to a closed mindset, because Claire goes on to say that she'd like to make sure that students are engaged with the learning that teachers are providing. And I think it's, I'd say a growth mindset isn't necessarily going to make students always engaged with what the teacher is doing. A growth mindset for students is the idea that they're able to learn and they're able to do things that they might have felt they're unable to do before. I think growth mindset or fixed mindset, it's still important for the teacher to recognize that students aren't just going to be automatically engaged in everything the teacher offers them. So I think Claire might be asking two different questions there. I think, Paul, you've probably got some ideas about how to encourage growth mindset.
My understanding from the research is that in a way you can sort of almost formally teach growth mindset in the sense that you can talk to students about how the mind is malleable, the brain is plastic, that we can construct our own abilities to a large extent. And that can be helpful. We've seen that in the Blackwell intervention. But then there's also research that shows it can make a difference the way in which you provide praise. So it seems important to be providing praise for effort and because if you're just providing praise for achievement, then there's a sense in which children are less resilient when they come across something that they find more difficult, because they've been taught to consider their achievements as something which is provided by their innate abilities. So if you say, well done, you're brilliant, then that's not going to be as effective in the long term as saying, well done, you put a lot of effort into that. Because otherwise, when the student comes across a new situation and they're finding it difficult, then they'll just think, well, this is something that I'm not brilliant at, and therefore I will not put in so much effort. But that's most of the research that I know in this area in terms of what you can do about growth mindset.
A question from Vaso is that she has some students who are achieving high grades in physics GCSE, but when they get to A-level physics, they can't cope with it.
I'm more familiar with the research in maths than in physics, but I imagine there's quite a few of the same issues. I think my understanding is that there comes a point where students are not able to get by any longer on kind of an instrumental approach to learning math. So quite a few students have quite a fragile understanding of maths that gets them up to good grades in GCSE, where they might be doing quite a lot of rote learning of knowledge that they're going to need, rote learning of procedures, and those students will struggle at some point when they get to higher levels of study and they really need a deeper understanding of some of the concepts and relations between concepts. And I think for quite a lot of students, that happens between GCSE and A-level, because A-level, the subject gets quite a bit more complex and involved, and students really need to have that grounding of the concepts. So I think what Vaso might be seeing is this, there's some students who have maybe that more fragile understanding of maths, who haven't had that kind of foundation of really understanding relations between concepts that they can go on to build on. What to do about it for those students that get to A-level and haven't got that foundation, I suppose, is a difficult question. But it might be about going back and revisiting some of that work that they did at GCSE level and thinking about how that deeper level of conceptual understanding could be built.
So I think probably my comments are quite aligned with Tim's in the sense that you're encountering more complex material and a greater quantity of material, and the agency of the student's own powers to autonomously learn suddenly become much more important. There are going to be many more occasions now where the student has to stop and say, hang on, I don't really understand that, and I'm going to have to do something about it. And so the student's own learning strategies start becoming more critical in terms of them making progress. So I think part of this is probably also just a general understanding, or something that could benefit A-level students is a general understanding of their own learning. And of course, there is lots of material around talking about learning strategies and study skills. And perhaps that sort of material, that sort of content, but also combined with some of the concepts in this course from the science of learning could be really helpful for A-level students as they begin to grapple with and understand how critical it is that they start taking more command over their own learning.
I think possibly in looking at 11 to 16 as a continuum and having a look at that progression of some of the big concepts in physics and making those links as you go along as well, so that students can see how the concepts are building, how they link together, and it's possibly worth sitting down as a team, as a department, to look at that progression of understanding as you go through from age 11 to 16, just to make sure that students are aware of the big ideas and how they develop through the subjects. We've got a question from Trish, who was very interested in cognitive load theory and would appreciate some more strategies for when they're discussing texts in class and reading in.
I don't know, Tim might be. I'm not sure I've got that much to add to this, because it sort of sounds to me like Trish is doing the right thing. She's grasped this idea of that you can't process two streams of speech, whether that language is actually written language or somebody's talking to you, but actually it's the same as having two people talking to you if you're trying to read speech and listen to speech at the same time, which is not synchronized.
Yeah, I'd agree with Paul. It looks like the teacher there's got the right idea that before discussing the text, the students need to have had time to read and understand the text themselves. And I was involved in, I was evaluated a trial of dialogic teaching, and that was, a lot of teachers have found a dialogic approach really useful in working with text and for encouraging children to develop and share their ideas in classrooms. So that might be something that Trish could look into.
I think people are doing more research in this area. So some recent research that I was having presented to me a couple of weeks ago, which I thought was fascinating, was that a lot of these very expensive books for children that encourage children to engage with reading, with a lot of extraneous visuals, are actually not very helpful for them learning to read, because it does overload their working memory, and it serves more as a distraction, really, rather than concentrating on the print, which I thought was quite interesting. So it's not just two different forms of language that can sometimes interfere. Sometimes just general extraneous, irrelevant visual information can be disruptive as well. But of course, we oughtn't to forget that making links between the text or verbal language and a visual representation of the concept, which is not language based, that can be a positive thing. Because actually making those links can require a bit of extra processing of the information of the concept, and as the concept is represented in different forms as well. So that can be a really positive thing. But it does sound to me like Trisha's grasped the central issue here and is doing the right thing.
Thank you, Paul. Andrew would like to know the cheapest in terms of time investment for getting enthusiastic about a subject that he's struggling to be enthusiastic about. I think there are a few ways that you could do this. So going online and having a look at some teaching resources with some interesting contexts, perhaps, or going on some CPD to develop your understanding and knowledge of the subject, working with a STEM ambassador, for example, so bringing somebody from industry into the classroom to talk about how something's applied in real life.
Yeah, I think connecting things to areas that you are interested in can be a very effective way of doing things and getting interested. You quite often find that there are links between subjects that you find quite dull and boring, and things which do get you excited. So in a lot of sport, I'm not that interested in sport, but a lot of people are. But if you're interested in sort of the physics of motion, then, for example, there's a lot of sports that really you can benefit if you understand the physics of motion. So I think that's probably the easiest thing you can do, is just try to find links with things that do interest you. If we're talking about children in a class, I think turning something into a game can be really effective. And in fact, just calling, so there is research that shows that just calling something a game, even if you haven't actually done anything to the task at all, but just introducing it as a game, appears to increase motivation and can increase performance and learning, interestingly. So it's a lot about how you present topics as well. And I think just imagination and creativity in trying to find the contexts in which to discuss those topics, interesting contexts, can really help. Something I saw a teacher do, which is an example of this, is gamifying an understanding of how a company works. So the children had to work the children had to learn what the person in the stockroom does, what the person in product quality assurance does, what the CEO does of a company, and all the rest of it. And what they did was to develop a game around that, where they were sending each other's emails. So he gave out emails and he said, right, look at the email and think about look at the email and think about how that suggests who the email should go to and who it might be sent from. And so they were sort of basically working as a postman, delivering the emails to the correct person, and practicing their understanding of what the different roles were within a company. So I think gamification is probably the most effective way. But in terms of time efficiency, that can take a lot of effort to think up that sort of game, really.
Thank you. Have you got any examples from primary maths teaching, Tim?
I think I'd go back to something that Paul mentioned about making links with things that help make the material a bit more meaningful for children. So, maths can quite often be very abstract, but really, maths has been developed to help us solve problems and carry out actions we want to carry out in as part of everyday life and work. So I think using those kinds of connections to make the maths more meaningful for children and finding ways to connect the maths that they're learning with things that children care about can be really effective. I think it can get away from maths being very abstract and disconnected from children's lives.
We've had a few people asking about courses in neuroscience and education.
Yes, so there are, as far as I know, there are only 2 master's courses in the UK that link together neuroscience and education at the moment. And one is run in London, which is a partnership between the Institute of Education and Birkbeck College. And that's sort of associated with the Centre for Educational Neuroscience down there. And then, of course, the other one is the one that we run here at the University of Bristol. And we actually have units on that master's that, for the assignment, you're actually developing lesson plans, developing a scheme of work, and researching and investigating and linking it to what we know about the science of learning, as well as learning more about how the brain learns and the corresponding psychology as well. So those are the only 2 courses that I know of at the moment in terms of giving you a university qualification in the science of learning.
So I was just going to say that people that are interested in following this and taking it further might not want to restrict themselves just to courses on neuroscience. I think what we've done in the courses show that neuroscience is one source of understanding science of learning, but there are quite a number of courses that look more generally at the psychology of learning and draw on neuroscience alongside other areas. And there's some really good courses at Manchester and Cambridge that would include neuroscience alongside more general understanding of psychology of learning.
Both Claire and John are wondering how they can apply the EBC model to their lesson planning.
So what we're doing now at the University of Bristol when we're training teachers is to actually encourage the student teachers, and this is something I would suggest might be worth looking at as well in terms of in-service teachers. One really useful exercise is to look at what the basic concepts are that we've encountered in the course and think about how those are related to a lesson plan. So what of these concepts, for example, the way in which the brain responds to novelty, is there something in the lesson plan that is novel, that therefore might, encouraging the engagement of the learners? And then when you think about, consolidation, the importance of rehearsing things in new contexts, is there something in the lesson plan that actually does allow the students or encourage the students to think about these concepts in ways, in new contexts, in new forms, linking between different representations of the same concept, etc. And actually on our teacher education course now, we explicitly encourage the students to mark the scientific concepts about learning on their lesson plan. And that's a really good way of developing a theoretical basis of what you're intending to do in the classroom. And that's really helpful for them when they're evaluating the lesson afterwards, because they can think, okay, this is what I planned, and this is why I planned it, because I thought this was going to be effective for this reason and effective for that reason. And then if it works out well, of course, you've got a great rationale as to why it's worked out well, and a useful one. But also, if it doesn't work out well, or things don't go as planned, or there are questions arise about how the lesson's gone, then you can use that theoretical understanding you had to try to understand why it didn't happen in that way. So, for example, in terms of novelty, was it novel enough for the students that I was actually with, or would they have encountered this before? If I was encouraging them to practice these ideas in new contexts, were they contexts which really sort of encourage the students to apply the information in new ways? Were they novel enough? Were they different enough? So, I think you can actually take some of these concepts. Maybe it's a good idea to go through the course and maybe make a little list of things that you think you've learned, and then ask yourself, how are they relevant to this lesson plan? And then after the implementation of the lesson, ask, do these things provide insight into what happened in reality?
Ottilia is asking about the effects of physical activity on the brain's readiness to learn.
So we know that physical exercise is really good for the brain. For one thing, fitness is correlated to ability in numeracy and literacy. And when we look at the way in which the brain activates when it's actually doing some work, then there's less activity in the frontal lobes, in the working memory networks for those people who are more fit. It's almost as if the networks are acting more efficiently, if you like, and they need less blood flow in order to get the same result. So physical fitness seems to give rise to greater efficiency in those networks of the brain, particularly frontal lobes, that are important for learning. But then there's also further research that shows just short bursts of activity, short bursts of exercise can improve short-term, long-term, and medium-term memory for the information that you encounter afterwards. So that's also a good argument as to why we should have exercise breaks and more regular exercise breaks in schools. And there's an awful lot of talk about the importance of physical exercise for countering health problems, and the importance of physical exercise for countering obesity, for example, the growing obesity problem amongst children and the rest of the population. And there's talk about exercise being good or sport being good for building teams and all the rest of it. But actually, there's a very strong argument for physical exercise purely academically. And of all the interventions that have taken place, and there's hundreds of them, all these interventions, they usually mean taking time out of the academic curriculum and devoting it to physical exercise. None of them have ever shown any negative effects, which is interesting, on the academic outcome, considering that you're reducing the amount of time on task. And half of them have shown an improvement in academic outcomes. So, the difference is probably just due to the fact that we are not really designing these interventions terribly carefully always, because we don't entirely understand what sort of exercise is best for the brain and for learning, although I think aerobic exercise that seems to be an important element. But the overall picture is that physical exercise is a very underutilized way of boosting not just physical health amongst our children, which is really important, but also academic outcomes as well. So we do need more physical exercise in schools.
Tamian is asking about which parts of the brain change due to meditation activities.
I don't think there's enough out there in the research where we could say, and the kinds of, there's not much evidence at all to show that using mindfulness and meditation I don't know what age children she's talking about. If it's primary, I think the evidence is very mixed. And I'd have thought there'd be a lot of individual differences and quite difficult to implement for a whole class. We talked in the course about how children need to be able to focus on the material that they're learning with. And if children have a good level of emotional well-being, then that frees up kind of cognitive resources to focus on the material in front of them. If for any reason children don't have emotional well-being, then that creates a level of distraction or stress, which means they're less able to pay attention. I mean, a really good example from maths is where children have maths anxiety. And there's been lots of work done on the effects of maths anxiety in classrooms. And essentially, maths anxiety occupies some of children's working memory, that increases cognitive load and means that they don't have as much attention to give to actually solving the problem. So you get this kind of spiral effect where children are anxious about doing maths, then that anxiety means they have less cognitive resources to work on maths problems, and that only increases the anxiety because they're finding it more difficult than other children would. So emotional well-being is an important part of learning, just because it's there in children's minds, whatever the sources of stress or anxiety might be. It means they're less able to focus on learning.
There's a lot of evidence to support the positive impact of mindfulness training in terms of mental health and mental well-being. And we know that that's really important for children, not least in terms of their learning as well. So I think the positive effects for mindfulness training and meditation in schools are probably quite directly in terms of mental health and well-being, and that justifies, that's sufficient justification for considering these sorts of interventions in schools. And then there's going to be an effect of that, good mental health and well-being on their work, because we know that anxiety and stress and depression and those sorts of issues, apart from just being very bad for children generally, that they also impact on academic outcomes. Of the research that's been done in terms of the brain and meditation and mindfulness, what we do see is a decrease in activity in the default mode network. And the default mode network is this mind-wandering network. And, you can make sort of indirect connections between that network and learning, because that network, when it's up and it's activating a lot, means you're probably not concentrating on what's going on in front of you. And so that's interesting, but we can't draw any firm conclusions from it at the moment. So we have to be a little bit careful, I think, at the moment about what we understand about meditation, mindfulness, and the brain. But there is some interesting research coming through that does show it helps you, focus on the here and now and what's in front of you. And of course, that could be learning.
Tammy, I would also like to know which students are involved. Which parts of the brain are involved when students show resilience?
In terms of what parts of the brain are involved with resilience and grit, what we do find is that it seems to be related to greater connectivity between the striatum, which is involved with your reward response, and the cortex, frontal regions of the cortex, which are very important for focusing and working memory, as we've discussed in the course. And then one of the arguments as to why that might be the case is because actually, if you've got distractions and you don't want those interfering with what you're doing, then it's important to be able to mediate those responses that are coming from the reward system, saying go off and have a piece of chocolate cake, go off and do the things you enjoy, and to be able to regulate that emotional response so that you can focus on what's in front of you and not give up what you're doing, but to be resilient and keep sticking at it and say no to the chocolate cake or whatever other things are inducing that approach, motivation, reward response.
And finally, can you talk in more specific detail about the parts of the brain that are involved in consolidating knowledge and learning?
So when we talk about which parts of the brain are involved with consolidation, actually so much of the brain is involved in that, because when we first encounter a piece of knowledge for the first time, it may involve a lot of those working memory networks. A lot of conscious effort is required to connect stuff together, and we're really thinking about the concept and we're aware of the concept. And when we consolidate, actually that representation becomes distributed across the cortex in many, many different areas. So I would say most of the cortex is probably ultimately involved in consolidation, in the sense that our memory and what we call knowledge and understanding is actually distributed very broadly across the cortex. And this is what we try to represent in those simple schematas that are in the course, where we've tried to say, we've got working memory network, activation of the frontal lobes, and then we have those arrows that sort of moving across the cortex to indicate that actually ultimately this knowledge is going to be widely distributed in many different regions of the cortex. So I think that's the main message. That there is also a very important subcortical region of the brain, the hippocampus, which you can't see on those simple schematas, and that hippocampus is very important actually for extracting the gist of what's going on and generalizing the concept before it is stored in your cortex more broadly, and making connections with other areas that are important, your prior knowledge, if you like. So we haven't talked very much about the hippocampus, but if you're going to ask me what are the important regions in the brain to do with consolidating knowledge and learning, we have to mention the hippocampus, because that's very much to do with where the knowledge gets stored first, but also gets played out, with the help of the hippocampus across the cortex when you're asleep. And that's a very important part of that consolidation process. I'd just like to thank everybody who's been on the course for producing such inspiring conversations and discussions. And I'm having a lot of fun reading all about them. And I've really enjoyed hearing about everyone's views and thoughts and opinions. So thank you for enriching my life as well.
Yeah, I think the discussion throughout the course has been really good, and it's been good to see people supporting each other as well by sharing their experiences.
I'd just echo Paul and say it's really good to see so many teachers interested in science of learning, and especially the number of teachers that are interested in taking their study and research in this area further. I think that's been really good to see.